Good morning, all you brave souls. I wasn't going to say nothing about it, and I can't quit touching my face for the last 5 minutes, and I feel like I'm going to sneeze. Uh, they've today's supposed to be a national day of prayer for the coronavirus stuff. So Sam already did that for us this morning. Keep people in your prayers. I think there's a balance. I think it's a real thing, and it's something that we should be concerned about for our own safety and health. But I think it's some things have been taken way too far, and I don't think God has us live in a spirit of fear either. Right? So just be smart and be safe, and if you need some help, call somebody. All right? That's what church family's all about. And if you're here this morning, you're sitting here watching this online, and you're sitting at home on a 3-year supply of toilet paper, I am praying some very specific prayers for you that you'll use all that toilet paper this week. So, I don't get it. I don't get that part at all. I just don't. It's I don't know. I don't get it. I feel bad for. I saw some elderly people in the store looking for toilet paper, and they couldn't find any. My middle son, he drove around Oklahoma City for a couple hours. Right, so. This morning we are here because it's Sunday and it's Lord's Day, and we're gathered here together to talk about God, talk about Jesus. And I hope that as we go through this morning, as we go through this series, this Lent series, that I will be able to hold Jesus up to you in his different circumstances, and that you would be able to see how he responds to his circumstances, and then compare that to how you might respond in your own circumstances in your life. So this is I think it's the third Sunday of Lent. We're right in the middle of the Lenten season. And so on the horizon is Easter, right? On the horizon is the resurrection. In the distance, salvation for all mankind. We can see it. But we can't get to it without going through the cross. And that's what Lent is all about. It's about preparing our hearts for the time when our Savior will be nailed to the cross. And for Jesus, as we're reading in Matthew 26, to overwhelm him. Help you always be our focus, and help our eyes always be on you. And then no situation in this world will ever overwhelm us. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen. So when you get to Niagara Falls, if this is able to pull you away from the current, you're going to go over when you hit that point of no return. When you get to that point, a crash is inevitable. And now imagine if you're standing on the deck of that ship, what is your reaction going to be if you're on that boat and you know that you've crossed the point of no return? Right? Are you terrified? Do you think to yourself, you just give up? I'm going to die? Do you go into self-preservation mode where you try to find any kind of safe place on the boat if there is one? Do you start allowing regret to wash over you, just like, oh my gosh, I wish I never would have gotten on this boat? And the reason I bring that up is because we all go through these kind of watershed moments in our lives, these times of great stress, times of great difficulty, and we stand right at that line, that point of no return. And how do we handle those moments when they happen? Do we allow ourselves to be paralyzed by fear? Do we grasp at self-preservation to just throw anything and anyone under the bus to save ourselves? Are we overcome with grief and regret and wallow in that regret? In Matthew, in our journey through Matthew, we are looking at Jesus' last days before the cross. And this morning, we're going to get to Jesus' point of no return. And I want to look at how he responds to that and how we might apply that to our own lives. and then we can act accordingly. So if you'll look in Matthew chapter 26, starting at verse 47. Remember, we stopped at verse 46 last week where Jesus was in the garden praying with his friend. And he says that while he was still speaking, because he told them, wake up, guys, my time has come. While he was still speaking, verse 47, Judas, one of the 12, suddenly a kiss, he's the one, arrest him. So immediately he went up to Jesus and said, greetings, Rabbi, and kissed him. Verse 50, friend, why have you come? Right? Circle that word friend. You're going to need that later on. Jesus asked him, friend, why have you come? Or some translations say, friend, do what you came for. Right? Then they came up, took hold of Jesus, and arrested him. At that moment, one of those with Jesus reached out his hand and drew his sword. He struck the high priest's servant and cut off his ear. Then Jesus told them, put your sword back in its place, because all who take up the sword will perish by the sword. Or do you think I cannot call on my Father, and he will provide me here and now with more than 12 legions of angels? How then would the scriptures be fulfilled that say it must happen this way? Verse 55, at that time Jesus said to the crowds, have you come out with swords and clubs as if I were a criminal to capture me? Every day I used to sit teaching in the temple, and you didn't arrest me. But all this has happened so that the writings of the prophets would be fulfilled. Then all the disciples deserted him and ran away. So I said that this was the point of no return for Jesus. Why is this the point of no return? Because from this moment on, right, we find Jesus all the way to the cross is under constant guard. From this moment on, he's surrounded by soldiers. He's not able to escape. From this moment on, his destiny is in the hands of the Pharisees, in the hands of Pilate, in the hands of the crowd and the soldiers. So we read the story, and let me ask you, when you see how Jesus responds at this point of no return, what do you see? Do you see any terror? Just prior to his arrest, Jesus has just been pouring his heart out to God, right, in the Garden of Gethsemane. You remember that? He was overwhelmed to the point of sorrow. His soul felt like it was being crushed. He knew it was going to be a difficult path. Luke's gospel tells us that he had sweat drops of blood while he's praying this, right? I've been in some stressful situations, but I've never sweated blood. It said that he needed angels to attend him. But when he gets done with that prayer, he ends that prayer with, not my will, but your will be done. Now, that's a bold prayer, folks. That's a bold prayer. You don't say something like that unless you really mean it, because you don't know where God's going to take you. You don't know what God's going to do with your life. You don't say a prayer like that lightly. Your will be done. Jesus is about to face, not just once in a lifetime, once in an eternity, pouring out of God's anger on himself for our sin. He knows that it's going to be the most difficult part of his ministry. And yet Jesus here, at this point of no return, faces that moment. I don't know any other way to describe it other than just kind of a determined resolve. And I can't help but think about the actual arrest itself. I want to read you the account from John's gospel, and you find it in chapter 18. It's in the first 6 verses if you want to flip there. But you get a sense that my betrayer comes. He went out with his disciples across the Kidron Valley where there was a garden, and he and his disciples went into it. Judas, who betrayed him, also knew the place because Jesus often met there with his disciples. So Judas took a company of soldiers and some officials from the chief priests and the Pharisees, and they came there with lanterns, torches, and weapons. Then, I am he, Jesus told them. Judas, who betrayed him, was also standing with them, and when Jesus told them, I am he, they stepped back and fell to the ground. Now, can you picture that? A whole bunch of soldiers show up to arrest you, and you say, who are you looking for? And they're like, you. I am me. And then they all fall down. That's usually not the way you want your arrest to go if you're law enforcement, right? Just picture that scene. You've got Judas there, right? You've got Judas who's about to get 30 pieces of silver for betraying you into the hands of these soldiers. You've got the officials of the temple. So you got all the religious people there just to make sure that they get the right guy. You got a whole detachment of soldiers just in case there's a battle. It says they have torches and lanterns and weapons. And what does Jesus have? 11 scared guys and 2 swords. And yet when Jesus says 3 words, he says, I am he, the scriptures tell us they fell back and fell to the ground. There's no terror in Jesus' heart here, right? He is not scared at all. In fact, you get the sense from reading this that he's probably the only one there in this whole group on either side that's not scared in some way. There's no terror. So what about self-preservation? When Judas comes to give him the kiss of death, doesn't Jesus turn away? And so Jesus doesn't turn away. He says, friend, do what you came for. Peter's ready to fight. He draws a sword. He cuts off the guy's ear. Does Jesus say, yeah, go, guys, go, get him, get him? No. He stops and he rebukes Peter. He's not happy that Peter tried to defend him. He seems like he's upset about it. Like he doesn't need Peter or anybody else to defend him. He says, do you think I cannot call my Father and he will at once put at my disposal more than 12 legions of angels? So a legion is typically 1,000, so that's 12,000 angels. Remember, it was one angel that God sent to Daniel in the lion's den that shut the mouth of all the lions. Could you imagine what 12,000 angels could do? That's power. Jesus doesn't need to defend. He could take the road of self-preservation, but he doesn't. What about regrets? Does he get to this point of no return and have regrets? Like, man, I should have never trusted you, Judas. No. He's known the whole time that Judas was going to betray him. If you go back to chapter 6 in John, Jesus said, have I not chosen you, the 12? Yet one of you, when he says that. Even then, Jesus knew what was going to happen. He could have exposed Judas at any time. He could have been like, you wear the weird t-shirt so that everybody knows who you are, betrayer. He doesn't do that. I mean, they had just come from the Lord's Supper, right? Put yourself where they're at. They just came from the Lord's Supper a few hours earlier, and in the middle of supper, Jesus looks at each one of his disciples and said, one of you is a betrayer. And each disciple says, surely not I, Lord. And when it came to Judas, Jesus reveals the truth, but not in a way that made everybody else suspicious. Jesus knew. He could have totally outed Judas. He could have made him a target. Do you think he regrets that now? Does it look like he regrets that now? As Judas comes to him and kisses him on the cheek, does he say, oh man, I wish I would have told everybody who you were? In John 18, it says when they'd finished praying, Jesus left the disciples and went to the Kidron Valley. Judas, who betrayed him, knew the place. Jesus could have gone to a different spot. This was like the regular praying spot. He could have avoided the whole thing. Judas would have never found him. I don't see a Jesus full of terror or full of self-preservation or full of regret here. He never says I should have gone to a different place or I should have just left town. Jesus is at a point of no return. The world has turned against him. The death and suffering which he's about to endure can no longer be avoided. And yet the Jesus we see here has peace. He's willing to accept God's will no matter what happens next. And he knows what's coming next. There's no terror, no fear, no self-preservation, no regrets. Think about that for yourself, right? We've all had times in our lives when we felt betrayed and our world has been turned upside down. We all have those days when we thought the people that were for us, we find out that they're actually the ones against us. Pulling the knife out of your back. Thank you, friend. It hurts. Betrayal is a hard thing to accept because, just by its very nature, it comes from a friend. Betrayal comes from a loved one. It's not a stranger who betrays you. It's usually somebody close to you. It's not a random act. It doesn't happen by just, you're not a victim of circumstances. Betrayal is very specific because it's a weapon that's only found in the hands of somebody that you love, somebody that you care about. Betrayal is an inside job. It's more than just being rejected. It's like rejection opens the door and betrayal pours salt in it. It's more than loneliness. Loneliness may leave you out in the cold, but betrayal is the one that shuts the door in your face, closes you out. It's more than an insult. Insults attack your pride. Betrayal, when you're betrayed, it breaks your heart. And it can take many forms. It can claim many victims. I think about the women that I know that don't feel loved because they don't look like a model in a magazine. I think about the man who works so hard to provide for his family, but it's never enough. Or the parents who just want their kids to show them a little bit of respect, but all they get is disrespect or cold shoulders from the kids. Or the children that don't even get the basics because their parents can't manage their money correctly. You think about the wife who's emotionally abused and made to feel like less of a person, or the husband who's continually derided in public by the wife who never has a kind word to say to him. Betrayal. It happens more often than we think. And what happens is you get all these people then that come, they feel like they've come to the end. They feel lost. They're hurt. They're lonely. They have no peace. They're afraid. They're full of regret. But when we look at our text, we see that it doesn't have to be like that. It doesn't have to be that way, because Jesus shows us that even in the midst of betrayal, there's a way that we can move forward. And it revolves around one significant word, and it was in verse 50, and I told you to circle it, and that word is friend. Because despite the fact that, humanly speaking, it's Judas who's about to put Jesus onto the point of no return, Jesus does something unbelievable. He calls Judas friend. And it's not with sarcasm, right? His words to Judas, they're just a culmination of what Jesus, the attitude that Jesus has had towards him the whole way, right? Jesus knew that Judas was the betrayer very early on, but we're never given any indication in the scriptures that Judas was treated differently, or that he was left out, or that he was mistreated, or that he was neglected. And when Jesus says at the Lord's Supper, "One of you will betray me," there wasn't like everybody looked at Judas, right? Nobody knew. The other disciples had no idea. Judas was smart enough; he wasn't going to out himself. Jesus never gave it away. He knew who his betrayer was going to be the whole time, and yet he washed his feet. He knew that Judas was going to stab him in the back, and yet he treated him just as if he was another faithful disciple. Jesus calls Judas friend because he sees what a lot of people don't. He knew that Judas's heart was being attacked by Satan himself, right? That Satan is just he's directing Judas's heart. Jesus knew how hard that was for him to withstand, how hard it was for Judas to go through that. It doesn't justify what Judas did, right? I'm not trying to minimize his deed. It doesn't release Judas from his choices, but it enables Jesus to move forward. When you keep allowing, when you personally internalize that, when you keep allowing betrayal to eat at you, when you keep on allowing the person who's hurt you to have influence over you, that's what they call, closing the door to the jail, but you're the one in the cell. In a world turned upside down by betrayal, Jesus shows us a road to peace. In Matthew 5, Jesus himself teaches us. He says, "Love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you." And he tells us that because when you do that, that's how you get freedom. That's how you get release. And maybe you're sitting there thinking, "Pastor, that's unrealistic. You don't know how bad it was, or you don't know how much I hurt. It seems too gracious. It's too much grace." But when you think about it, what's really the alternative here? Does harboring anger and bitterness in your heart, does that solve anything? No. Does it even remove any of the hurt? No. Even if you could punish them, even if you could get revenge, how much is enough? How much hurt is enough? And think about the bigger picture here. Do you really want to walk through life with this philosophy of life that says, when people hurt me, I'm going to hurt them back? When I have a right to be let down, I have the right to be angry and retaliate? And we call him the betrayer, right? We can single him out as the betrayer, but there's a lot of other people in this story that fit this category. Judas may have been the one that turned on Jesus, that kissed him on the cheek. But you think about James, John, and Peter right before this, right? Closest to Jesus. Remember from last week? Jesus asked them to pray, and they fell asleep. Or what about Thomas, Andrew, Nathaniel? All of them, right? It says all of the disciples ran away and deserted him. Is that not a betrayal? Before the sun comes up, Peter's going to deny Jesus 3 times. Jesus' closest friend in the disciples out for the Messiah. They're the ones that plan to kill him. Is that not a betrayal? Or the crowd who calls for Barabbas to be released, probably a lot of the same people who just days before were hailing Jesus as a king. Is that not a betrayal? Caiaphas, the high priest who knew. What about us? How many times have we turned our back on Jesus? How many times have we closed our ears to his voice? How many times has his call in our lives been put at the very bottom of our priority list? People ask us about our faith and we don't talk about it. We're embarrassed. Or we go out into the world and we act like unbelievers even after we've professed Jesus as Lord. Sometimes we betray Jesus too. Sometimes we don't think twice about treating the Savior of the world like this. Sometimes we're just as guilty of treating other people the same way. And yet, for all that, in spite of all that, for all these reasons and so much more, Jesus still steps on to this point of no return. Jesus still steps on the road to the cross for each one who does and will still betray him. He still came. He still walked forward to bring forgiveness to his betrayers. He came to open a door of peace for everybody who had been betrayed. He comes to offer forgiveness. Why? Because that forgiveness brings freedom. It brings us a freedom to live life without fear. It gives us a freedom to live life without self-preservation. It gives us freedom to live a life without regret. I don't know why you're here this morning, what brought you here, what's going on in your life specifically, but I want to ask you, will you meet Jesus on the road to at this point of no return this morning, on the road to the cross? Will you accept Jesus' forgiveness for you? Will you cross the point of no return for the one? Father God, what a blessing it is to hear your word.